Sisters and brothers, I'm honored to offer my reflections, thoughts, and responses to the very rich message we have heard from our keynote speaker and the first respondent. I thank the keynote speaker for a well-thought, well-tailored, and well-presented, yes, I would say, a very Lutheran and Catholic speech. The speech points to a reality we all must face: change, namely change. Change is the only constant, and we are here reminded of Heraclitus' aphorism: no one ever steps in the same river twice. Change and its associate crisis should sensitize the church to recognize and respond to God's call to address the signs of time. Crisis, in Greek, crisis, decision, implies time for making decision. Responding to change and crisis demands a change in thinking patterns and structures meant to spread the gospel in serving God's people. This, my friends, is reformation, the transformation of forms. The fact that this speech is anchored on biblical and historical attestation stresses the importance of handling the issues presented with utter seriousness and from our worldview as Lutherans. The challenge the speech throws to the Church Universal is immense. The message to the growing churches in the global South, Africa, and particularly Tanzania, where I live, included, is that growth is a change that breeds crisis. Growth demands reform. A new wine should not be put in old wineskins. We must acknowledge something positive in the rich fool's thinking. The old barns cannot accommodate the bumper harvest. Just like churches whose membership is reducing in numbers, churches with growing numbers face a challenge related to service. We must confess and let go of the irresponsible euphoria and the triumphalism accompanying growth in numbers. Those who fill the pew of our churches are not just many. They are, and probably even more important, they are diverse. They have differences and varied needs and expectations. And some of the expectations are, theologically speaking, unfounded. They need guidance. They need formation in foundational principles of our faith in Jesus Christ and what it means to us today, not only in the South, but also globally. The question we should therefore constantly ask ourselves is whether our systems of service and our ministries meet the needs of the people in our churches, in our context. In addition, full churches do not always mean that all have come in. To paraphrase Professor Halik's speech, we should ask ourselves, what are the signs of time in this growth? What are the signs of times in this reduction of members in the other part of the world? What are the signs of time? What is God calling us to respond to in this crisis? Stewards should not boast of results in an immediate step of a process, the end result of which they cannot determine. Neither should the stewards lose hope because of a failed harvest. We can learn from the farmers. They don't lose hope during the time of droughts, for example, or floods. The church must distance itself from claiming credit for its growth or blaming itself and losing head because of the reducing or shrinking number of church members. Growth remains a change, a crisis. Time for making decisions, time for asking God for direction and guidance. And here, dear sisters and brothers, it is reminiscent of the testimony recorded in Acts 2:47. In line with the theme of this 13th Assembly of the Lutheran World Federation and the challenges put forth by the keynote address, our churches must acknowledge and confess that the persistence of poverty and injustices are to a significant degree results of the church's inability to express oneness with the society. The church's alienation, its lack of unity in spirit with the poor, with the vulnerable, with the marginalized, has contributed to the economic and social sufferings of the masses. Jean McElland, in his book, My Faith is an African and African Cry, in his titles, he says, this cry and concerns have not found much resonance with the church's efforts in addressing the social and economic crisis besetting Africa today. Rather than being important ingredients in addressing the crisis of the people, the writings of Jean McElland and other Pan-African thought leaders like Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, and Leopold Senghor seem to have been relegated to history. Such teachings may have sounded too radical and revolutionary to a peace-seeking church that does not want to engage peace-disrupting efforts. Such inactivity in the church overlooks the severity of poverty. It overlooks the severity of injustices, diseases, and violence. In many African countries, poverty has created complex, ramified, and ruinous scenarios. It has, on the other hand, been idolized. And this poverty has bred some kind of self-pity manifest in the spiritualization of ordeals. God, like for example, God is on the side of the poor. The handling of COVID-19 pandemic by some Christians made me ask myself a lot of questions. A significant proportion of Christians in my country tended to consider prayer, devoid of any precautionary measures, enough. My word of counsel was, do not test God. Do not tempt God. In a slightly different but relevant context, St. Paul says, I will pray with the spirit and I will pray with the mind also. On the other hand, poverty has been used as bait by insincere preachers who exploit those running away from it for personal gain. This is partially why misleading theologies have taken root in Africa and other countries, both in the global south and in the west. These scenarios demand that the church takes up the call to oneness of the creation seriously, seeing the suffering of the masses in light of its complacence and determining to take decisive action to respond to the needs, the rights, and the dignity of people in our churches and societies. This is a call to reclaim and reaffirm the holistic mission of the church, which encompasses liturgia, koinonia, martyria, and diaconia. Allow me to add that the prophetic diaconia and advocacy of the churches plays a crucial role today in addressing the challenges of our time. Rather than being put off and frustrated by the crisis, in our context, the church in Africa needs to recognize and exploit resources at its disposal. In the first place, the church needs to realize that the plight of Africa is not attributable to Africa alone. The big nations have a lion's share in the suffering of millions of people, not only in Africa, but across the globe. The church in Africa should call, and I hereby beseechingly call sister churches in the West to raise a prophetic voice against the atrocities perpetrated by their nations. Churches in the West should rebuke their nations' engagement in all forms of injustice like production and trade in weapons of mass destruction, activities that contribute to environmental degradation and climate change, trade imbalance, and all sorts of inhumane policies and nations. And here, while full of admiration and thanks for what churches in the West have done, I emphasize you need to do more. Allow me to speak to the need for a meaningful and mutual relationship and solidarity between our churches globally. The paradoxical way in which some Christians and churches in the South relate to those in the West is yet another crisis we are facing. I see in churches in Africa, especially those born of the 19th century missionary work, a relational crisis between Christians in Africa and the West. On the one hand, churches in the West are primarily considered benefactors. We must transform this relationship into one of equals, as one family of God. We share the same identity, one body, one spirit, and one hope. As churches in the global south, we treasure the good relationship we have with churches in the West. However, if we see members of our communion from Europe and North America primarily as benefactors, we easily idolize them as supporters without whom we cannot manage our affairs. This makes our relationship fragile. But perhaps hidden in such a sensitive relation is hypocrisy. Because on the other hand, Christians in the West are considered lost in their unbridled liberalism. They are not one with us. You may sometimes hear such voices. As a result, the church in Africa is sometimes caught in a moral crisis. When and how can we rebuke or correct sincerely the church in the West and be honest? Neither the churches or Christians in Africa who have parted ways with fellow Christians in the West, nor those that maintain a hypocritical, I would say, relation exhibit the spirit of oneness of the church as professed in the third article of faith. Sisters and brothers, I also noted, probably more importantly, that the keynote address points us to hope. In the dark nights of history, in the valley of dry bones, the Lord of the church says, "My grace is sufficient. My power is made perfect in weakness." Probably wary of the idealism and unfruitfulness of the notion of mission as movement from center to periphery, from positions of power to positions of weakness, missiologists today see reality in mission from the margins. Rather than succumbing to sanctimony, the church is called to recognize the presence of Christ in its weaknesses. The church must stand and face critical remarks that even question its relevance in the society. The church must acknowledge where it has become anti-mission, where due to the illusion that things must remain the same, it has resisted change. Andrew Kirk sees in mission the act of listening and hearing. According to him, understanding what is mission is a matter for the whole people of God, listening to what the Spirit of Jesus says to the churches, hearing the sorrows and joys of people's daily lives, and listening to one another. In part, I am because you are. I am because you are. I am thought of, therefore I am. Dear sisters and brothers, this is the oneness we should all cherish. It is embodied in the deep African philosophy of Ubuntu. I see in the keynote address a tonic for renewed thinking and practice of mission. Unless I see and recognize my face, I recognize a sibling in the face of another. Unless I recognize the oneness of life in the entire creation and learn to honor that, as Professor Halik has said, we still remain in the darkness. For this, I am grateful to you, Professor, and I wish all of us a fruitful deliberation. Thank you very much.